What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. And today for you, I got a brand new meta tier list video on my opinions on what I think the meta is going to be like. I think it's a perfect time given that we're about to start the YCS season or YCSs this September. And even though the competitive season may have started a little bit ago, we are finally reaching kind of the pinnacle of competitive play now for the YCS. A couple weeks have passed of data to really have a good understanding of what the meta is going to be like. So assuming there's no ban list, I'm going to give you guys my opinions on what I think the best decks are and what to prepare for, what to expect a lot of, and just what I would bring to an event. Before I continue, please make sure to go check out tsx1.com and use the code POTATO10 for 10% off on your sleeves. These are the sleeves I use. They feel great and they last pretty long, so I definitely recommend using them if you're going to an event anytime soon yourself. Yeah, let's get into the video. So here we're looking at a tier list with a bunch of decks that I think you can talk about for the meta. Many of them may not be the most competitive, you can kind of tell which are ready. Over some are a little more debatable. Anyways, let me explain the 5 different tiers I've set out here. And the meta is rather diverse, so just saying tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 may misconvey how I truly feel about the format. I think you can probably line up around 6 decks that are tier 1, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. I have to go through my thought process here, and they would all be picks I would believe could win a tournament. However, there are ones I think are better than others to small degrees, and for the current period, although that may change. The meta changes ever so slightly. So that's why I have best decks, strong options, and then weak tier 1. All those 3 are considered tier 1. None I consider strong enough to be a straight up tier 0. But small edges within the tier 1 bracket that I wanted to differentiate those 3 tiers. After that's playable rogue stuff I feel I could top, maybe win a YCS, though very unlikely. Just stuff that can definitely win top regional, can definitely do well at an event, and are good, but not quite at the top level of gameplay that I consider to be tier 1. And then after that is bait, and that is just decks I think aren't worth playing. Or if you have fun with them, that's great and you can play it for sure, but I would really not set your expectations too high in a tournament. They aren't what I'd consider very competitive. Okay, so I guess let's get actually into the decks. The first one here is Branded. Branded right now has kind of switched into 2 variants. One is the standard Branded variant with expulsion stuff, or even the slightly different with heavier bestials and just no expulsion. Sorry, not expulsion. Sanctified with Gimmick Puppet. Expulsion's banned. Combo is pretty much the same though. Or people are playing the Chimera deck. The Chimera deck is very different though, so I wouldn't really lump them into the same thing. They are different. The Branded deck still has all of its weaknesses, I think, and it didn't really get any new resources for me to say I'm a fan. It's just a bit clunky, inconsistent. It can lose to cards like Barrier and to Ash way too easily. And I think that sometimes it just can't play through a field well enough either. Because of that, I think it kind of just belongs in a playable rogue. It's not terrible, but its weaknesses are a little too glaring. You can't make up for the weaknesses that it does have, and because of that, I would position it there. Next up is the Chimera Branded deck, or don't even have to play Branded cards, but the Chimera engine in general, which is still being solved, and this one could change as people still figure out the best ways to optimize this deck. But it is rather strong. You get the discard, you set up the Guardian Chimera very consistently. Guardian Chimera is obviously a fantastic card, with the effect negation and the targeting protection that make it kind of annoying to deal with, and your late game and just general value gain is really strong. That being said, the deck kind of feels a little weird going second when I've tried it. You are relying a lot on non-engine, and they don't fit the best like non-engine if they do like cash into this deck, so a bit iffy there. But I do think it is rather strong. I put it in weak tier 1. I think it still has some big open spots where it's blown up by an Ash still, or D-Barrier still hurt very much. And then just you can't always play stuff like a Rise Heart that well, and just general consistency things that I've found have been kind of frustrating. Just fusion decks in general, I find it's rarely great for them to be prime spot of the meta, just because the general way that fusions work, it often opens you up to a bunch of weaknesses, needing multi-card combos to get going, as well as just huge weaknesses to Barrier. So I'm putting in weak tier 1 right now. I think you can very much win an event with this deck, and I do think it is strong. And despite Dune seeming to not be that good, this is definitely one of the better options that come out there. Next up is Fluandereeze. So this was kind of low-key talk of the town around the time of the WCQ season. The Europeans especially really liked this deck. It seemed to have a decent catch mashup, and a decent Runic matchup. However, with both decks kind of falling off in popularity, you can argue if this is still good. Versus stuff like Rescue Ace, the Negate would kind of make this not the best to play. I'd also argue that you don't really have that easy of a time versus Unchained, just because they can pop your monsters. It's really hard to get to the tributes. In general, I think if your opponent knows how to play against Flu, it becomes kind of hard to play through any field. Maybe that's just my experience, but I really don't think this deck is that good. However, you can prey on people's inexperience against it, and you get to play a lot of the best tech cards in the game, as well as a lot of the best consistency cards in the game, like Dualities. I think it would probably fit in the lower end of playable Rogue. I definitely think this deck can do well, though I never really see it winning an event. Next up is Ultrageist with some brand new support from Dune. There was some talk about this deck being potentially playable. However, this doesn't really fix the issues the deck had. When the deck got going, it was already rather strong. So with the new cards allowing you to extend your combos even further, you're not really helping your situation. Maybe you have some better turn ones now, but still not that crazy, and they are multi-card combos that aren't that, special. It kind of feels like Labyrinth, but just worse. I think the deck kind of remains exact same as it was before, and that is just bait. Which may suck for a lot of players who like the deck to hear, but none of the problems it had got fixed with the new support. At least I don't think they did. So now Runic for Hire Sprite is a deck that we would have all considered tier 1 at the WCQ season, although now it kind of feels like it's fallen off greatly. And we have to question, is that just because it's not popular, or is it actually fallen out of meta? I think, honestly, it underperformed the WCQ for a reason. I think it was overrated to begin with and how good it was. Its turn 1 fields are fantastic, but I think going second, it kind of falls apart. The Runic cards seem like they're flexible as being non-engine and engine at the same time. However, I think when they act as non-engine, they're rather low impact, and you need to string together very complex multi-card combos to actually pan out. While it's very possible, I don't think that happens enough of the time for the deck to consistently perform going second. And what's even worse for a deck like this is when you want to plan to beat a specific matchup and there's a wide meta, it comes rather hard. And with the way the meta is shaping up, it doesn't seem to do the best in it purely. It has a hard time because of the targeting versus the Chimera deck. Like the Unchained deck has too much floaters to really deal with, and the Rescue Ace deck as well just kind of puts up too much advantage for your board breaker type strategy to put up with. I think this deck just can't win enough going second for you to be consistently choose it as a viable tier 1 option. The deck is still fine. It can win going second, and going first, its impactful field is still great. So I have it in Rogue, but I don't think it holds a top tier position. Next up is Heroes. I debated even putting this on here, but it did top the NAWCQ, and people still love this deck. It has some cool combos that are actually really strong, and it has a bit of extension to push through stuff. However, it still very much feels like Glass Cannon, where it can get burnt out by hand traps, or just field cracked, or even just struggles to play into a field. All of which really make it kind of hard to put anywhere good. I also think your deck's engine has to be so heavy you can't rely on the non-engine like other decks that have similar problems. That I think this deck is just straight up bait. Next up is Kashtira. I hate this deck. I've been vocal about it, yet I keep playing it, and that's for a reason. This deck is so good. Most other decks, when you think if they're going to be playable, including some of the Rogue ones, when you think of matchup spreads, you always think, what do you do versus Shifter? What do you do versus Arisar? And most of the time, the answer is you Squirm. It sucks. And because of that, this deck just remains to have an incredible matchup for so many things. Going first, it feels so strong. You have to dedicate your non-engine to it, and that's the way the meta is shaped. Non-engine seems to be geared a lot towards Cash. Because of that, I think Cash just is the best deck, or one of the best decks, and I hate to say that. Going second, it is fine, despite all the hate that is dealt towards it. It plays into removal fairly well. With negation, it's fine. It's specifically the book cards that tend to cause an issue to it, but most of the time those aren't searchable, and you do play lances and other stuff you try and push past. Except as Labyrinth. Labyrinth continues to be a deck that performs well, and I guess I should have specified if there's furniture or not furniture. However, the strength of Labyrinth, I feel like, is the fact that the entirety of its engine doesn't really seem to fall in the crosshairs of the non-engine that everyone else is playing right now. Cards like Talents, Thrust, Book of Moon, Book of Eclipse, the most popular cards, and Ash. Ash hurts for sure. Thrust and Talents are live, but they're manageable, and the Book of Moons are very low impact versus them. Because of that, I think Lab is rather well geared the way the meta currently is, though that can't change. And then obviously Labyrinth can spiral very fast. It feels like the modern Ultrageist. Once it gets going fast and then becomes very hard to control, but it does so in a better manner and faster than Ultrageist. And I think it's less weak to the books and plays off the field better. So I just think the way the meta shaped up in terms of people's non-engine, as well as the deck just still being a strong deck that can still also sack out wins going second with either a lot of traps or a lot of furniture cards, making it an actual just strong option. I don't love that you have the glaring weakness to stuff like Ash and Bell and Cosmic, which can just end your tournament in a heartbeat, which seem to have very little counterplay, especially if you play against someone who is more prepared for Lab. Then your matchup spread does change quite a bit, and that scares me a lot from playing it for a tournament. But when you get those favorable matchup spreads where it doesn't even matter which matchup it is, but a lot of the time what non-engine they play, then this deck can feel really strong. My other issue with this deck is, like many other decks, the cash matchup feels not great. Going first, you're fine. Going second feels really hard if your opponent plays properly. That's a big if, because a lot of the time that doesn't happen. If your opponent plays properly, the Labyrinth player should almost never win going second versus cash. And when you think cash is the best deck, it's really hard to justify playing Lab. However, if I could choose to never play against cash, Lab would be a very strong contender. That being said, it also has a weaker matchup versus Unchained, another brand new deck which is popping up a lot. And that's another weak matchup. You don't want to have multiple weak matchups, so that's kind of where I put Lab, though I think I'd probably rate it higher than a lot of other people. But next up are the Visas, Manadium, Scareclaw combo decks. I am tempted to put this in bait, but I'll put it in Playable Rogue. I think this deck is not good. So the issue with these linear combo decks, especially like this, is they play completely off of with monsters in the field. And if they clear your field as the Manadium player, you really have very little to extend past that. Decks like Danger Tier or Shizu Tier had resources in the hand or grave to keep pushing past removal, and Manadium feel like it doesn't. And that makes it really weak going second into so many fields, especially where in this meta it feels like we've shifted towards mostly removal-based interruptions rather than negations. It makes Manadium just feel poorly positioned. Yes, it's going first is very strong, but that doesn't mean sometimes you can't brick or just get Nib impermed out of the existence. Nib is very popular in side decks right now. So is Droll, and then Shifter as well versus the Cash Tier decks, which makes me think you're kind of coin flipping, and then you're also still losing sometimes when you go first, albeit not that often. And when you put all that together, it kind of just feels like it's not the best. Some people say that you can fit a lot of non-engine in here, but it still doesn't feel genuine because with non-engine, you can almost always stop your opponent from doing anything grand, but it's unlikely you ever fully stop your opponents. But even a single Book of Moon can turn off the Manadium combo in a similar way that it turns off Cash, and that just makes me hesitant to play something like Manadium. So yeah, not a big fan of this deck. I've been pretty vocal about that before, and I could be wrong. Could be my biases turning me against it. Like, I think this deck is like bad, and me putting in Playable Rogue feels generous to me. I'll put it there because it's still scary, and if you play against it, you can very easily just lose if you lose the roll. Next up is Marine Cess. This deck saw a little bit of play before the WCQ as well. Herman Hansen brought it to the EU WCQ and did fairly well, however losing out the last 2 rounds of Swiss to not make it. He says it's due to misplays. Misplays or not, we don't see this deck doing that much anywhere else. Now, I got a chance to play this deck a lot more in preparation for the World Championships, though I never played the deck on stream or in any matches. I did practice it and bring it to the tournament. The deck's actually better than I think it is, than I thought it was before. You have a couple options to set up your field. You're not locked into any one specific thing. Your extra deck is a little flexible as well, where you can put like Dweller stuff in, like the Bahamut Toad. You make the towers. You can go for a long game with Bubble Reef, and then Wave also makes your field unaffected, which is very strong. That the going first for this deck actually feels like a lot better than I thought it did, better than I thought like Salad is, and I always thought this deck was kind of like Salad. This deck also has better ways of clearing the field with Zelantis, something that I really appreciated, because Access Code didn't always cut it before, especially if your stuff's all mono attribute or you get locked out of it with the Salamangreat Fire locks you and Princess Water locks you. There's Zelantis helps you. Yeah, I think this deck is really cool. And you get to play like a heavy amount of non-engine as well. You can really pick it up. That being said, this deck is also really weak into removal. So in a meta where there's a lot of removal, it feels kind of there. So yeah, I think if you're in a very effect negation type meta, this deck could maybe thrive a little more. But it really impressed me when I got a chance to play it, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. I'm gonna put it in playable rogue. I don't think this deck is completely terrible. That being said, matchups aren't great for stuff like cash, and removal can just be hard. Although if you put it up against a lot of the other playable rogue decks or bait decks, it does very well. And the non-meta and the non-engine options being so large for the deck, I mean, you can generally suit it to fit whatever the format requires. Next up is Mathmech, or other Cyber decks. So in theory, these decks seem good. They have one-card combos. They can OTK very easily. They can fit a lot of non-engine in, but they seem to be very fragile. Single hand trap, single books, just tear it apart because the one-card combo deck and doesn't play that well on the hand. Circle is really the only card, and you don't have that many copies of it. Yes, there's ways to search it, but then you don't have ways to search Defensor, and it gets kind of weird. And I don't know. Anytime I played this deck, like I tested it thinking it'd be fine, and it was just really bad. I think this deck is bait. Don't try it. Yeah, it can steal some wins. Yes, it can have some impressive turn ones. Yes, it can OTK going second. It just doesn't feel right for me. I think it has too many issues, and for that, I'm putting it in bait. Next up is Mikanko. This deck is a cheese deck. I'm sorry, this is Omega bait. The reason I put it in here is people keep asking me what I think of the deck, and they keep saying it could be a decent rogue deck. I'm saying it's not even that. It can really punish players who don't read the cards and kind of get a grasp of the deck immediately. If you don't know what's happening in front of you and you aren't able to see what's going on with the moving pieces, you will get killed really fast. Where if you can see what they're going for ahead of time, and just requires a little intuition and knowing what the cards do a little bit by reading, you should be able to stop them. Most decks have answers to Mikanko, like soft locks with a can't target, can't destroy. And once you break through that soft lock, that crumbles. It just feels like a deck that preys on people who aren't that experienced. But that's never going to be enough to win a tournament, let alone topping a major event. Maybe a regionals, but not in a competitive scene. Next up is Purely. Purely got the new support with Dune, and a lot of people hyped it up to be this crazy deck, myself included, thinking it'd be rather strong. However, as the non-engine specifically has continued to push towards anti-cash Tira, Purely falls very heavily in the crossfire as well with those tech cards. The books, lances, we're even seeing often in the Doom right now. And then talents as well is also fine versus the deck. And that leaves Purely in a really precarious spot where you're just getting destroyed by these non-engine. In fact, even more so than cash. And because that exists, that's just making those cards more popular, because now those cards have better coverage. And that's where Purely just, gets beat down a lot. You just lose so many games to the non-engine. And when you get shut down with Purely by non-engine, it feels like you have no defensive cards left. Not like cash, where you can still end on a little bit and try and stabilize. It feels like Purely just dead. And that's a terrible feeling to have. You can't play Lance in this deck like you can with Cash Tira either, because if you go Yeep and you chain Lance the book, you still don't resolve Yeep. In fact, Lance is even better against you than it is against decks like Cash. Because of that, I feel like it ultimately just goes in a weak tier 1. Engine feels incredible, but I think it's just position versus non-engine right now makes it way too vulnerable for me to put it comfortably in as a strong option. And while I considered it greatly, I ultimately would not feel comfortable bringing it to an event. It feels like there's just a major target on its back, even though it's not the most popular deck. Next up is Rescue Ace, another brand new competitor. Obviously, it's not completely new, but 2 new cards out of Dune have pushed it into the meta. Turbulence is a fantastic card, and now you can get to it way more reliably. Adventure gives you that Book of Moon effect, as well as a little bit of extension tools. We've already talked about how Book of Moon is one of the best cards for interruption right now versus so many of the top tier decks and even some of the rogue decks. That makes Rescue Ace quite a good option. Now, you can also manipulate your Rescue Ace deck to do a couple things going first, not just Heat Salt Pass. You can do stuff with IP, you can do stuff with the Cybers package, you can do stuff with Sunlight Wolf, you can do Ibly stuff even, and you can do Dweller stuff. The options are kind of wide, and you can suit it best to whatever you need to deal with the meta. And I think it's a rather strong option when it goes first. However, I don't like how sometimes you can't play through Ash. Not all the time, but more often than I'd like. And going second, you don't actually have that many non-engine slots to combat the meta, which can sometimes leave you a little weird. It plays from the hand okay thanks to Emergency, but like a book plus an Ash will definitely stop you in your track. And that happens often enough that I don't love the Rescue Ace cards. I think they are a strong option, but it's not a deck I personally would bring to an event myself. Next up is Rika. I really never felt the appeal of this deck, although people play so badly against it because I guess it's a rather complicated deck to play against that it seems to always do well. I think the deck is weak to back row removal, and as that starts to pop up more and more to deal with Cash Lab, Rescue Ace, and all the book cards, this kind of suffers a little bit as well. I don't have the best understanding from the deck's perspective of what it loses to when you play it. I just from playing against it, if you play properly, you shouldn't then have that hard of a time. I think Cash is a bad matchup if played properly. I think Lab is a bad matchup. I think even the Chimera is probably a bad matchup. Just because you can apply so much pressure with the Guardian Chimeras and the heavy resource advantage. Rescue Ace doesn't play with monsters that much, where if they go first, it has to be pretty bad. I guess if you go first, it's fine. And I'm honestly not sure about the purely matchup, but this deck just doesn't feel that good to me. I put it in Playable Rogue because its combos are good enough, I guess, and enough people do make mistakes against it that it's fine. But I really don't like this deck. And I think if people got a good grasp on playing against it, it would fall off rather fast. Even more so than it already has. Next up is Dragon Link. Never really got why this came back into the meta in the first place. I guess when Bystials are well positioned in a meta, it does show up. We aren't in that meta. Like, Lights and Darks aren't that common. You can get Mirror Sword Knight versus the Chimera deck. You can hit the Labyrinth Furniture cards versus Lab. Kind of hit a Cat versus Purely, but these are all low value. So you're really relying on the actual Dragon cards themselves being good. Where Dragon does thrive is its late game is actually really good. With stuff like Regained and the Magnamut getting Levianeer for next turn, and the draws off Regained, and then Seal specialing from the deck, and then Savored adding back, means that your turn 2 and turn 3 pushes are really strong. That's what makes the deck appealing, and then when you play this deck, that's what you have to aim for. It's a solid turn 1 with a lot of pushback on the following turns, and you're trying to beat this deck. You're trying to minimize the fact that their turn 2 and turn 3 are going to be relatively high impact, considering they've comboed on the first turn. I think when it goes first, it is rather strong, but going second, it doesn't feel great to me. Again, it's weak to removal. The book cards can be rather high impact, and the Bystials don't seem that great positioned into the meta. For me, it's probably the most playable rogue deck. You can argue putting it tier 1, but I really don't feel comfortable putting it there. Next up is Runic. I'm going to call this just Runic's twin sprite. I probably should have put a twin there. The sprite will be something different. It's just Melfi sprite, I guess. So this deck has also fallen off a lot, but I think for similar reasons as the For Hire, its turn 1 going first is great. Turn 2 over turn 1 going second, not so much. And I'm not going to over-explain the Runic cards again. I think it's matchup spreads and advantages, disadvantages line up so similar to Runic For Hire that they kind of just count almost in the same deck. Argue maybe I should have just put one deck there, but whatever. Next up is Salamangreat with the new support from the Legendary Duelist Soulburning side set. They got 2 new cards, another Debug, but with Saladin's name. And you got the Link 4 that searches the Counter Trap or the Rage. It's fine, but the deck still is weak to Nib. It's still weak versus removal. Like, a Book of Moon is still going to be very hard for you to deal with, which is so popular this format. And your end field isn't anything fantastic. It's really just, yes, the 2 traps and the Raging Phoenix. Maybe you can set up a Dweller, but it's all kind of hard. Going second, yeah, you have access code, but it really doesn't feel that strong. I really hate this deck. You guys should know, at least if you watched a bunch of my content, that I don't even like hate the deck from playing against it. I just don't think it's good. I think it's just a bad deck. So I'm putting this deck as straight up bait. I don't know how it won in regionals a couple weeks ago, but I think this deck is ass. Yeah. Next up is Melfi Sprite. So this is another deck that is considered to be tier 1 going into the WCQ season. More and more decks are popping up though that use removal, and more decks are playing book. I think Sprite again is rather weak to books. Yeah, if you have the Nimble Beaver, you can put the extra body in field or starter. It's not completely vulnerable. However, a second removal piece or an Ash plus a book can often just turn off the plays, which makes me not love it going second. Going first, it feels pretty strong, and most of the time you feel like you can win going first. But again, still the stuff like Shifter will turn you off. And there are some hands where a simple Ash or an Imperm can just end your life. And even with the Melfi cards, sometimes Eclipse just turn off your Melfis and you lose. The follow-up with this deck isn't that good either. It feels kind of similar to Dragon Link to me, to be honest, where it is a pretty strong turn 1. It can play okay into fields, not the best into removal, but I think it has worse follow-up than Dragon. So I think I had to compare it versus Dragon. I'd put it after Dragon. Decks that are close to being tier 1, but I still think they're just playable Rogue. If any of the Rogue decks had to win an event, I think these are the two I would have as most likely. Next up is Tears. I love this deck. I think this deck is actually pretty solid. However, you absolutely cannot win versus Shifter or Arise Heart. And I think the only ways to build this deck to beat the other decks consistently is to make it like a heavy aggressive combo deck, which forfeits that matchup entirely, which sucks. So unfortunately, I have to put it in playable Rogue. I think it's about middle of the pack here, and its matchup spread is a lot more polarizing than other decks. When it has a good matchup, it has a really strong matchup because you can aggressively push through a lot of fields, and going first is a really strong, at least the way I play the deck. But then versus Shifter Arise, your win rate's like 10% less, or less even. Next up, I got Unchained for you guys. This deck has been all over the DB rated. This is the deck I've been trying out on stream, and I've quite enjoyed it. At the current moment in time, people maybe aren't playing against it properly, they aren't siding for it properly. Maybe that's why it overperforms. But I really like how this deck has a really strong turn 1 field. Its follow-up is fantastic. It feels like Dragon Link in that regard. But also, most removal is really bad against it. The Book of Moons are below average. Popping is even worse than below average, probably. They're pretty bad against this deck. And it feels relatively well positioned into most decks in the format. It has a solid chance to play through fields with just Engine alone. You can still fit around 10 to 14 on Engine in here, depending how heavy you want it to be. The deck is a little inconsistent at times. Feels like Cash in that regard, although I'd argue a little more consistent than Cash. And yeah, I think the deck is just rather solid. I think when I go first, I feel very comfortable that I can win. There's very few people that are well prepared for it right now, although this can change. If the deck continues to see success on DB, and that starts to convert even more to regionals, and then with YCS Brazil, which at the time recording hasn't happened yet, if it does well at that event, then maybe we start seeing people find new tech cards that deal with Unchained and it falls off. But I really like this deck, and I'm going to have to put it as one of the best decks. Now remember, I don't think the best decks have that much over the other two tiers below it. I think there are small edges, but if I had to enter a tournament, those are the two best decks that I'm considering. In fact, as I leave for Brazil, I'd say there's a 99.99% chance it is either of those two decks there. Those are the ones that I'm eyeing to win Brazil, either of which will be on my team. Haven't fully decided yet. I am bringing both decks with me, and my team will kind of last minute choose. But yeah, that brings one deck, and that is Vanquish Soul, a deck that is only a couple months old and has been doing the last few WCQs, regionals, whatever. It's shown up. I think this deck is bad. I think its best thing going for it is you can play, there can be only one, and you can dodge targeting effects, which gives you a little bit of a better position versus stuff that's removal based. But I still think you're going to struggle versus something that's going second because you don't really have any push. Even if you can kind of not be weak to the books or whatever, you can't actually crack the field. Therefore, you don't threaten anything, and their follow-up will just kill you. I don't like that. I think when you go first, your end board is just not strong, so you get punished a lot in that regard as well. And I think this deck is just bait. It may be the strongest of the baits. This and, like, I guess the Mathers Salad are the best bait decks. But I don't think that's much to be proud of. I don't think the deck is very good. It just feels like Invoked, almost. Like a continuous cycle of advantage, but with no pressure. It's just not good. Like, you have to punish players, make mistakes into it, or burn their own cards trying to stop you. But if they just sit there and do nothing, you kind of just do nothing yourself, which is not something you should be doing. Going second, you need to be applying pressure. Anyways, yeah, so this is how I feel the meta would shape out. I think there are about 6 decks I consider tier 1 that I really like their position in the format. I think there's a lot of decks that are actually just playable. You should expect to see a tournament and are fine. They could even win a tournament. There's some decks that are played that bait, but overall the meta seems to be very wide. I could very reasonably play against all these rogue decks at a tournament more confidently than I would have in the past. And then there's a pretty wide variety of decks like I firmly consider in a tier 1 position. Even within these tiers, there's some variation among the level of power. With playable rogue, these are not all created equal, but I didn't want to go too you know, small details for stuff that I felt wasn't that important. Okay, guys, I hope you found that super informative. If there's anything you don't agree with on my tier list, let me know down below. If any oversights I made, or if the meta changes in terms of non-engine or what's popular, so can the tier list itself. And you guys can give your input there on how that has changed. If you enjoy these types of videos, please let me know so I can keep making stuff that suits your guys' interests, because I want to do what you guys want to see. And right now it seems like I have a lot of competitive meta audience, and that means stuff like the tier guide. So I will continue making content like that in the future. Also, go check out my VOD channel, Jesse Cotton YGO VODs, on YouTube. It's where I'm going to post on my Twitch VODs now on, so they aren't just going to get deleted. And you guys can see me play Master on there. You can see me test out decks. You can see me do the deck doctors. And even some videos from here will be pulled from streams, so you can see them raw or even sooner before I've had the chance to edit them. So yeah, make sure you guys sub to that and check that channel out. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you soon.